In the last section, section 8, we finished the side seam, and with the side seam we finished the body of the sweater. So in the next section, section 9, we're going to work on the sleeves. The sleeves are the same on both sides, so the instructions are just for one, and you're going to repeat the same thing on the other side. For the sleeve, I'm going to use DPNs just because that's my personal preference and also the way I kind of learned to knit. But you can knit the sleeve with circular needles as well, or whatever your preferred method is. They should be the same needle size as you have used for the body. The sleeve is kind of split into two parts, and the first one is where we finish the traveling stitch pattern that we've created from the body, and when there are no more of those traveling stitches left, then the second part of the sleeve is knit in reverse stockinette, and then the last part is the cuff. So to start, I have just undone the knot here that of the waist yarn that holds my sleeve stitches, and I'm going to place the sleeve stitches back onto my needles first before I continue with picking up stitches, and I'm going to use a total of 4 DPNs, and so I'm going to place my stitches onto 3 and work with the 4th. So I try to go for about an even number of stitches, but it's always a bit iffy. Let's see. This is traveling to this direction. So as you can see, I have still the waist yarn still in place, and I'm just going through the stitches as well with the needle, and also don't forget the stitch marker. And I'm going to place those stitches on the needles while they are also still on this waist yarn, just to make sure I'm not dropping anything. And the last one here. So now that all my stitches are on needles, I can take out the waist yarn, and I usually go between the needles and pull it out on one side. And then do the same on this side, and now I can pull it through both sides. And the stitches are back onto my needles. You obviously still want to have the right side facing out, so if you've not turned your sweater around after closing the side seam, that's what you want to do first. And the next thing, before I can actually knit the full sleeve, I'm going to need to pick up stitches from these extra row we worked before the side seam. So those extra rows, I think I've mentioned it before, so those extra rows kind of are the same thing as you'd have when you cast on extra stitches in a top-down sweater. So they are for better movement and better fit of the sleeves. And so we're going to pick up stitches from the edge stitch here of those extra rows, and we're going to start in the middle here where the side seam is as well. I'm still working with my main color and my main needle size. And I'm going to pick up just one stitch for me because I don't have that many extra side rows. So I'm just going to, so this is my middle where the side seam is, and I'm going to insert my needle through this edge stitch here, both legs of this edge stitch, and I'm going to knit. So this is the pickup part of the pickup and knit, and then you knit this picked up stitch, and that is one stitch picked up and knit. You do this as many times as you need to, and you don't really have to worry too much if there is like a little hole between those picked up stitches and the stitches that we're going to knit for the sleeve, because you can go back later when you weave in the end of this tail end here and close this little hole, because there's always a little bit of a gap, and you can close that when weaving in the end. So what you want to make sure is that this tail end is not too short, and you can close any holes that are in there. So best thing here is make it a little longer, just to make sure you don't have too little. And then you work the sleeves in pattern. Sorry, my needles are a little too long for this. First part of the sleeves, we have to finish this slipped stitch traveling stitch pattern, and we do that by just continuing the pattern that we kind of established in the side sections. We're still going to work decreases here in the middle of the row after the stitch marker, and we have to balance out those decreases by working increases before the first traveling stitch and after the last traveling stitch of the sleeves, to balance out the decrease that we're making here in the middle for the pattern. So that's like one thing that's going on. And the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to work decreases to shape the sleeve itself, and those happen at the beginning and the end of the round. Each sleeve unfortunately has a separate set of instructions, because the number of those traveling stitches is going to be like a little different for each size, and the number of stitches that are just purled before the first slipped stitch is also different for each size. So the instructions are separated for each size, so you can follow the instructions for your size, and it has all those decreases and increases in there, so you don't have to do any guesstimating, and at the same timing you can follow the instructions. But I wanted to mention it, that we are working decreases at the beginning and the end of the round every so often to shape the sleeve, to make it taper towards the cuff. And whenever we work a decrease in the middle, we are also going to make an increase before and after the pattern. So because the gauge is actually a little different from the traveling stitch pattern to pure uninterrupted reverse stockinette, there is not always going to be an increase whenever there's a decrease in the middle of the row, and that is to kind of balance out this slight difference in gauge. So if your pattern doesn't have an increase, even though there's a decrease in the middle, then that is because that decrease in stitches balances out the slight difference in gauge from those two patterns. So I'm going to finish my setup row here. It's a little trickier with the double pointed needles, especially if a traveling stitch is traveling onto a different needle, but nothing I don't think you can handle or I can handle. So I'm finishing here the last stitches from the stitches that were placed on hold from the body. And I still have to pick up one stitch from my extra side rows. So I am inserting the needle through both legs of one of those extra side rows and pull a stitch through. Again, how many stitches you need to pick up is depending on your size, and you can find this number in your pattern. So after you've picked up these stitches and you're back at the side seam, you can place a marker to mark the beginning and end of the sleeve round. or you can do it like I'm doing it. I'm not going to place a marker because I have used my double pointed needles as markers, so I know that between those two needles there is my beginning and end of round. On the second setup row is something that we'll encounter that is different from the body, and that is we're now going to slip the traveling stitches on a right side because we're now working in the round, so there is no wrong side rows anymore, and the wrong side rows were the rows where we slipped the traveling stitches. So now we work in the round, and we work one round where we have those 1 by 1 right purl cross or 1 by 1 left purl cross, and then we work around where we slip the knit stitches. So I've worked in purl until I reached one of my knit traveling stitches, and I slip this one here now with yarn in back, purlwise with the yarn in back. There is another one, so I bring my yarn to the back and I slip this knit stitch purlwise with yarn in back. On a decrease row where you work decreases for shaping the sleeve, you work 1 purl stitch and then you purl the next 2 stitches together. And then you work in pattern until you reach the last 3 stitches. And when I reach the end of my round, I work another decrease, another purl 2 together decrease over those 2 stitches, and purl the last stitch of the round. Purl 2 together decreases are directional, but I find that you can't really see a difference between this one and making a decrease that slants in the other direction, so I'm not going to bother with making different decreases at the end, at the beginning and the end of my decrease round. So I'm just going to make purl 2 together decreases. In the previous row, my 1 by 1 left purl cross ended just before my stitch marker, which means that in the next row, so the one that I'm working, not in the one that I'm working, but in the following one, I'm going to work a decrease here in the middle. And for that, I prepare by slipping the stitch marker 1 stitch towards the right. For that, I can either place a new marker and then remove the old one, but what I usually do is I slip the stitch to my right hand needle, I remove the marker, I slip the stitch back to my left hand needle and replace the marker. And now the marker is 1 stitch further towards the right. If you have a spare marker over, you can just place one and then later remove the second one. But here I'm going to continue working with slip 1 purlwise with yarn in back, purl 1, slip 1. I'm already at the last slipped stitch detail here of my sleeve, and I'm going to finish this here with a decrease, a SK2P decrease. I slip the first stitch knitwise, knit the next 2 stitches together, and pass the slipped stitch over. And then from now on I can purl all stitches, and I can actually remove the marker here as well. I have finished the sleeve of my sample sweater here, my tiny mini version, and what you may see is that it looks a little different than before, and that is because it just didn't fit, the proportions just didn't fit, so I had to add more of the stitches that were part of the side seam and add them to the sleeve, so the sleeve is a little wider than it was in the earlier video. But what it also shows nicely is how the pattern continues from the body up to the sleeves and finishes here in the middle with those nice little decreases here in the center. What you can do to like change or adjust the length of the sleeve is work fewer rows between decreases, and then they will like taper down faster, and you will have to work fewer rows to get to the cuff. And an alternative just would be to work fewer repeats, which means fewer repeats of straight rows and decrease rows. I highly recommend doing that in the plain reverse stockinette section and not so much in the pattern section, because otherwise you will not be able to follow the pattern completely if you have adjusted the number of decreases that you work. But obviously feel free to do that as well. I'm going to switch over now to my contrasting color and to the smaller needle size for the cuff. The cuff is worked in 2x2 ribbing, which means 2 knit stitches followed by 2 purl stitches. So we need a stitch number that is a multiple of 4. And that's why we have to decrease either 1 stitch or 4 or 3 stitches in the setup of the cuff. So depending on your stitch count, you might need to decrease 1 stitch or you might need to decrease 3 stitches. So with my smaller needle size and my contrasting color, I'm going to work in a setup row where I decrease 1 stitch and knit all the other stitches. I'm going to knit the stitches because I'm moving to a contrasting color, but I also recommend working the setup row if you're just working with one color or continuing working with the main color. I'm going to do my decrease right here by knitting those 2 stitches together. When I've reached the end of my setup row, I'm going to make a knot with these 2 tail ends of the main color and the contrasting color, just to make sure everything is nice and in place and doesn't move around too much. I'm going to undo that knot before I weave in the ends, and I'm going to tuck those in to the inside of the sleeve so they're out of the way. And now I can continue working in 2x2 ribbing, which means knit 2 stitches, purl 2 stitches. For however many rounds you want to make your cuff. The cuff in the pattern is a folded or doubled cuff, which means that you work kind of twice as long as you want the cuff to be in the end, and then you're seaming the bind off to the inside and have like a double layered cuff. And that's what I'm going to do now. So I'm just going to work in 2x2 ribbing until the cuff is about twice as long as I want my final cuff to be. For my cuff, I've worked the setup and then another 8 rounds in 2x2 ribbing, and I'm going to bind off all stitches in pattern now. If you wanted to have like a single layer cuff, you would have to work half as many rows before binding off. I'm not a very tight knitter, so I'm okay with binding off in my main needle size, but if you're a super tight knitter, you might want to go up with the needle size for the bind off. When I only have one last stitch on my right hand needle, I break the yarn but I'm going to leave a long tail end because I'm going to use that tail end to tuck those stitches or seam those stitches from the bind off to the inside of the sleeve for my doubled cuff. And then I pull the tail end of the yarn through the last stitch and pull to secure and tighten. I have threaded the tail end through a needle here, and what I'm going to do is now I'm going to seam this bind off to the inside of this cuff, and for that I'm going to fold this inside out for a bit. So if you have a larger sleeve, this is going to be a lot easier. And then I want to have a little bit of the main color sleeve showing here on the inside. Then I'm locating my tail end here, and then I'm folding the cuff in half. So the right sides of the cuff are facing out and the wrong side is facing inside. All around. And now I'm going to start to whip stitch the cuff to the main part of the sleeve. So I'm going to locate the first knit stitch of the 2x2 ribbing, which is right here. So that's the first stitch I'm going to whip stitch, and I'm going to locate the purl bump that is associated with the setup of the cuff and that first knit stitch that is here. So that's the purl bump that goes with that first knit stitch, and I'm going to insert the needle through this purl bump and through one leg of the first knit stitch here of my 2x2 ribbing, and then pull through. And then I'm moving one purl bump over and insert the needle, and I'm going to insert the needle through the second knit stitch here, and again only using the first leg of the stitch, not both legs of the stitch. And then I'm going through the next purl bump over here and the next bound off stitch. And I'm going to work around the entire cuff like this. So let's see, I think this is a bit hidden here. Don't pull too tight, just tight enough to secure it all. When you have contrasting cuff, it's really nice and easy to see this last or this purl bump here because it's in the main color. So this is the only seaming in the sweater. We're doing this with the cuffs and the neckline as well. Other than that, there is no seaming in the sweater at all. Let's see, I think we are already around the cuff once, and I can now weave in my ends here, or can just leave that for later and fold the sleeve back out. And now I have my beautiful doubled cuff on the end of my sleeve here. After repeating the instructions for the sleeve on the other side, the sweater looks like this. Barely fits onto my little screen here. So the sleeves are finished with the cuffs and they're seamed to the inside, and it's time to finish the body with the hem and the neckline.